Welcome back to another episode of Lost LT's Razor. Today is the 250th birthday of the Marine Corps as we're recording, and we have a great guest. His name is Ty, otherwise known as Aura Ambush. I'll link his profile in the show notes. Today, a few of the things that we talk about are with respect to the PLA. So today we talk about why you as a team leader, squad leader, platoon commander, etc. should study the PLA. What are some common myths and some myth busting that we can dive into? And then understanding, hey, in a training environment, what are some realistic things that you can incorporate into a training plan? Last thing is providing a few resources, and then really it's just a great conversation today for Ty and I to get into that. So without further ado, here is the episode.
I'm the old man.
And I'm Lost LT 1775, an infantry officer and captain in the Marine Corps. Welcome to Lost LT's Razor, where the fight, the leader, and the lessons learned all matter. Ty, thank you for joining us today, and go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit of your background, if you would, please.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Like you said, go by Ty. I run the Aura Ambush account on Instagram, where my mission is to pass information specifically about China to the junior warfighter, mostly junior Marines, but anyone that wants the good info. We're being more inclusive to the Army now, I guess. So making fun of them a little bit less lately. Why I got into this is a passion of mine. A former infantry NCO in the Marine Corps, all on the East Coast. And I got into doing the small UAS stuff before it was a primary MOS, but got heavily into that, and it just timing wise was able to interact a good bit through that with the air wing, and was able to go out and participate in some air wing stuff, and saw the way that they trained to fight enemies versus the way that we train to fight our potential enemies on the division side. And it was a big difference in the way that the naval aviators at the wing train against a very specific threat. They have very specific data on it, and they have their game plan built around, this is the specific aircraft I'm going to go face. Here's my capabilities. I know my own stuff 100%, but I also know a bunch about them, and I'm going to tweak what I'm doing. Just slightly if I'm fighting, a Chinese J-15, or if I'm fighting a Russian Su-27, even though it's the same base aircraft platform, and you're still engaging in the same form of combat, just as we would be engaging in the same form of combat on the ground with, Iran, or with the Taliban in Afghanistan, or with China in a potential fight in the future. There are those little tweaks that you adjust, and those little things that you change when you're fighting a very specific opponent. So kind of pursued the goal of how can we take that air wing mentality of being very specific and not putting the cart in front of the horse, and trying to dump a bunch of enemy tactics and everything else on junior guys who really just need to learn their own stuff. But how can we take some of that specific stuff and package it in a way where it's beneficial to the guys, to where when you have first-term Marines going through a workup for a MEU or something else, their leadership, their team leaders, squad leaders, platoon commanders that maybe already have a little bit better tactical basis can take on some of this information and drop those little nuggets or those little breadcrumbs and tie it into the things that you're learning as you work your guys up. So I think we see a lot of alignment with the goal of your podcast here, and what I am trying to do. So glad that you're having me on today.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's one of the things that you said that I found interesting is just the first term Marines. I mean, this is something that we all talk about all the time, of the turnover and how it's, you wish you could get the next generation right up to speed. I mean, imagine like the attention to detail and how good we are at systems and processes by the end of, a full workup and deployment at a unit. Imagine if you could start with a next generation essentially at that level, and just how much higher we could get. So I think the focus and the goal really of both of our pages is to try to just share lessons learned and make complex things simple for people to understand. So I totally agree with you, and it's interesting. I didn't know that you had a background working with and around the wing, but I've got a massive amount of respect for really the attention to detail. I mean, we can in the infantry community take so much away from the professionalism of the ready room. I think it's understated. I mean, in every capacity. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, imagine what we could do if we had a 2 to 3 year pipeline before you hit the fleet and kept everyone on a 10-year service commitment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, seriously.
Sure we would have a little bit more time to get the stuff for sure. And then the funding that they have.
Yeah. Well, the funding, not to mention, we could take a few of their dollars and be a little bit happier. But so
if everyone had $100,000 for a helmet. But yeah, I think the first thing I wanted to get into really before we dive into stuff is the why it matters. And whenever I hear personally, and I'm sure maybe you can agree with this, some of your listeners can agree with this, is whenever someone tries to give me a why it matters about China, they immediately start talking about really big picture things. So we start talking about chip fabs in Taiwan and 100-year plans with the party and everything else. And to me, and this is one of my core ethoses, I guess. I'm not sure if I'm using the term correctly, but how does this help me if I'm on an island somewhere with a squad of Marines and we run into a squad of PLA soldiers or PLA Navy Marines? Like, do I really need to know the 100-year plan or whatever else? What are things that tell me why it matters at my level as a team leader, squad leader, platoon commander? And I always like to tie it back into, imagine if you were in some sort of legal trouble, or if you weren't, you just needed to have an attorney. And you went to your attorney and you said, hey, I'm very concerned about this potential law or this potential charge that I could have. And your attorney told you, well, I'm a pretty good attorney, and if that ever comes up, I don't really know anything about that right now, but I'm sure that someone will tell us about it, and then we'll have a good plan. And to me, that's fundamentally what you're getting as a platoon commander, as a squad leader, or something else. If one of your junior Marines comes up to you and says, hey, Corporal, hey, sir, hey, Sergeant, we're going on a MEU to the Pacific. I've been hearing a lot about China. What are we doing to train for that threat? And you tell them, I was top of my class at IOC, and I don't really know anything about them, but I'm sure if we go there, the two might tell us some stuff, and we'll be solid. It's like I don't know if I'm getting that warm and fuzzy from my leadership. So I think the leadership benefits of just being able to talk about potential enemy threats, especially the big ones that the junior guys are paying attention to and seeing in the news and seeing all over social media and everything else. I think it's a tremendous value add as a leader. And frankly, it's at this point a necessity to be able to speak at the Marines level about things that they are concerned about or things that they want to discuss in more detail.
Yeah, well, and when I think of what you just said too, I mean we know that it's on the shoulders of every platoon commander, staff sergeant, squad leader, etc., to lean into these things and talk about it. I mean, you can't just wait to be spoon-fed information. And I think that I don't think that we're necessarily saying that people are waiting to be spoon-fed, but I wonder if people just don't know where to start, because every time you hear the topic, there's just so much information thrown at you and coming from a million different ways. And it's like, if you haven't been studying this information for your entire life, then you're already behind in the intricacies that go from decades and decades. So like, if I'm a corporal first term, but I know that this is a problem that I need to teach my Marines about, like, where would you even recommend starting, and what are some things that they could tangibly do right now, I guess?
Absolutely, yeah. And that was a bit of hyperbole in my example. Of course, I would hope that there's no platoon commanders out in the fleet that are answering that questions the way that they are, and if they are, I have full faith and confidence in our IOC instructors that they have smartly sent those guys to LAR where they can do limited damage. But yeah, somebody's got to ground guide those those LEVs. But yeah, I think to touch on, and that's a great segue into my first thing, and that's the specific tactical benefits that you can get from studying the PLA. And I was talking to my brother about this last night, actually, who's an infantry captain like yourself, also in the same general area, doing a little bit of a different job. But the biggest thing, and this is from my perspective as well as a team leader, squad leader in the fleet, the biggest thing that I want my guys, including my other squad leaders, including my team leaders, and everything else, is to live in your own tactics and know your own stuff, forwards, backwards, left, right, in the rain, at night, and everything else. And I know that sounds like a cop-out answer here, but if you know your own stuff, like I said, you know your own stuff 100%. You are locked down on your own stuff, even if it's just the on paper, everything else. I can just show you a picture of a PLA squad at an exercise where they're all standing in formation, and you can just look at 8 to 12 guys, depending on sort of unit type, and you can just look at the equipment that they have. And if you are locked onto your own stuff, you just look at that picture as a professional and you are already thinking, here's how I would employ this squad. Here's, what I think of the weapons that they have. Here's how I would maybe organize that and everything else. And then it requires very little enemy information. And this is going back to the intro where, we want to make sure that we're not interrupting the development cycle and the very well thought out, very well developed workup cycle and first term training cycle that we have for Marines. But the more you lock down on your own stuff, the less information it requires from an intel end or from an external support entity end to show you about China and really any threat for you to be able to really start to make some assumptions. And then when you get into those briefs with your two, or you start to get more specific in detail of just studying enemy weapon systems, there's a lot of stuff that you can look at from a squad level. And obviously you're never in a fight where it's just an isolated squad against an isolated squad, but there's a lot of stuff that you can start to look at a squad and team level where, as long as you understand your stuff, I can give you very little information about here's the weapons that they have, here's in general rates of fire, and here is max ranges for point and areas. And then you can really start to drive your tactics on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that me and you talked about before having this conversation today was, I think we essentially summed it up as steps of implementing PLA focus like into your training and kind of using the knowledge of that potential adversary and informing your training. Because I think just speaking from my own experience here, I think there's a pretty heavy training scar in force-on-force exercises that I've seen recently where we've updated our threat systems. Gone are the days of Soviet-era arms, right? We've updated our threat systems for obviously preparing for a potential fight, but we're still putting, a squad of Marines out there in a defense or attacking a position, and like we're using Marine Corps tactics on Marine Corps tactics. So like and I'm sure you've seen the same, and I think that's probably a common feeling across the fleet. So I mean, what are some of the tangible things that you can see us doing in fixing some of these training scars before we commit it to memory so much that we're so rigid and we're just fighting the Marine Corps against the Marine Corps, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so I actually I want to circle back on that in a little bit, but I have a specific example that when you really start to get into infantry tactics, you can start to, like I was rambling there for a bit. It's kind of early in the morning for me out on the West Coast, but you can create, and this goes back to the air wing example of they're matching their capabilities with enemy capabilities, and you're trying to overlap your engagement zones with enemy detection and engagement zones. And there's a lot of stuff that you can look at. And if you really start to, like you said, we're not just going Marine Corps tactics on Marine Corps tactics. we're knowing our tactics and then we're working from there and we're using them as a springboard. I always like to say, you can't think outside the box if you don't know the box. But once you know the box, then you can think outside the box. So there's oftentimes with first term junior Marines, sometimes you'll find very eager junior team leaders and such that think they're thinking outside of the box and they're still inside the box and just doing things poorly because they don't know the box. But if I know my box and I know in general what China can do, I can look at something like, oh, hey, in general, unit type specific, and this can obviously vary, they can adapt very quickly, but in general, they don't have any low velocity grenade launchers like we have at the squad level, and they're generally very, very light on mortars. So if I'm going up in a fight against them and I encounter them, if I know my stuff, I know my, what my weapon capabilities are, but then also my Marines, there should be, in general, a little zone right around the 300 to 400 meter range, depending on how good you are in environmentals and weapon type or munition type with your grenade launchers, that you, as a squad, inside the box Marine Corps thinking, can create that combined arms dilemma. And a typical Chinese squad cannot. They can only present at that 300 to 400 meter range a direct fire threat, whether that's light machine guns or rifles or potentially some rocket systems. But they're not able to squad organic generate that indirect fire threat. Obviously, SUAS changes that calculus a bit, and that gets way too detailed, as you know, to get into hypotheticals there. But little things like that should be coming up organically with your Marines when you're looking at stuff like that, and platoon commanders and platoon sergeants and senior squad leaders should already be sort of coming up with that stuff on their own. And those little light bulb moments of things like that, or things in the defense, looking at you never want to fall back on systems, but thermal capabilities, or even just looking at, oh, hey, this Chinese squad is 10 guys and they have 2 light machine guns. Not something I love from my end, that they have belt-fed light machine guns and I don't. But I also know that when I'm looking at this table of organization here, and they have 2 light machine gun teams, so there's 4 guys tied down, squad leaders tied down, they have like a heavy rocket system and some other people tied down. Their maneuver element is at best 3 guys, and if they start to go over that, they're starting to degrade some of their weapons capabilities and stuff like that. So you can start to make assumptions about your defense. And I want to be careful when say assumptions, because left of bang, really everything is an assumption. A lot of people will claim that it's intelligence or a plan or anything else, but we're in heavy assumption territory right here. But again, to just reinforce the importance of studying this stuff, I'm sure everyone's saying, where do we learn this? We'll touch on that here in a bit. Yeah. But you can make actual specific tactical decisions and tie those into your exercises, or things like on the attack, to turn back to the grenade launcher example, even if I'm looking at a typical Chinese squad where it's really just rifles and 2 light machine guns, I can really get into dispersing my elements as an offensive force, or just someone that's in a meeting engagement or something else with a Chinese force. And that typical Chinese squad will then really start to struggle. And yes, light machine guns are area effect weapons, but they're only pointing at one person at a time, even if you're swinging them around. But the closer I get, I can continue to disperse my force and really open up. And yes, I might lose some control of my element there, but it really starts to create more dilemmas for a typical Chinese force versus a typical American Marine squad that's a little bit larger, maybe has a little bit better communications, and then should have better individual initiative. So little things like that are just very important, and things I like to point to as, here's specific things that you should be thinking about beyond just, oh, this is their rifle, I slapped this on Marine Corps tactics, it has 50 to 100 meters less engagement range. Like, yes, that's great, but now let's think of how we're going to implement that into what we're doing.
Yeah, 100%. If we could go down a rabbit hole for maybe a minute or two, I would love to hear you kind of paint a picture for us of, and I mean, and you kind of did, but really, like, either squad versus squad or platoon versus platoon. Could you just kind of talk us through some of maybe you kind of alluded to some critical vulnerabilities within a PLA squad with the lack of IDF, like indirect fire capability within the squad, direct fire weapons, right? But if you could kind of paint us a word picture, where is the Marine Corps stronger and where are the Chinese stronger essentially in squad level engagements versus platoon and kind of so on and so forth, if that makes sense there.
Yeah, so it does get a little, once you get to platoon, right, as you know, we get into task organization, and the Chinese have a concept like that it really does make things a little more challenging to compare. I would say squad to squad, and you can kind of find this going on up. The Marine Corps and anyone that's worked with any sort of outside entity, including the U.S. Army, can tell you, but we are very, very heavy on explosives, like the low velocity grenade launchers, even mortars as well. I don't know how much you've worked with foreign militaries, but the British are close maybe with light mortars, but no one really brings as many light mortars as the U.S. does. 60s, and I would include 81s in that, maybe medium light mortars there. But at the squad level, at I would say platoon organic level, right? The light machine gun thing, a little hard to get over. That's definitely something that they have as a potential asymmetric advantage. One thing, and everything is subject to change once contact is initiated, obviously, but no one's ever really seen the Chinese in training or otherwise, including large scale exercises, really maneuver squads like we would in platoons as independently as we do. And part of that is a control thing. Like you had the podcast with Joaquin last week where he got into some of the political and ideological things that drive the Chinese. But from a tactical level, they just don't sling around the level of sustainment in personal gear and kit and ammunition that we do and train to do on a regular basis. So when you get a Chinese force that is a little bit more isolated, it becomes much more static. And part of that is, to some extent, conditioning and average size of the Chinese male and of the Chinese soldier. They are, in general, pretty significantly smaller. That's not to say that they can't, bring unbelievable weight across unbelievable distance.
Right.
The Chinese were able to lead the Viet Minh through some pretty insane logistical situations at like Dien Bien Phu in the Indochina War, for example. But you see, I would say, typically less maneuver. You see less emphasis on actually closing with the enemy. When you look at, even just looking at some of the propaganda films that are released when they're running fairly scripted ranges, if you compare that to films of Marines or your own experience running through the ranges at 29 and the different facilities on Lejeune and everything else, you see much smaller maneuver elements. You see much less aggressive maneuver, and you see a greater emphasis at the squad and platoon level on support by fire because of lower organic support. I would say when you get into the company and battalion levels, things like those, the 81s platoon or CAT or all the different iterations that we're going through of different sniper and scout platoons and other capabilities like that when it comes to a direct fight, they are much weaker. I would say that I would not discount their ability to take initiative on their own, like a lot of other people do. That's probably my biggest point of contention with other people's analysis. I know as much as people want to point to, it's this communist country and all of these ideological things, there's just not a lot of historical examples, even back in the 20th century, of the PLA being really restricted at the tactical level. At the tactical level, they every time they've been in a fight, and that hasn't been very often, but every time they've been in a fight, including times where they had much more restrictive leaders like Mao, they were much more flexible with what they were doing.
I think that's actually a fascinating point because you might be, I think that's why you said it's a hot take, but I mean, genuinely, I haven't really heard many people argue the counter before of saying, because like I hear a dozen times, that we don't think that we don't expect them to execute decentralized to a certain extent, because we know how centralized and the oversight, the political oversight that Joaquin and I were talking about last week as well. And while I think there's probably truth to that in some levels and at higher levels for sure, maybe there is a gray line that you're kind of alluding to, where down at the tactical level, if you see a gap that you can exploit, I think it's human nature to some extent to shoot the gap and execute, and kind of that maybe tone the line of asking for forgiveness, not permission type thing, if they truly think that it would achieve some sort of intent, if that makes sense. So I think that's a great point, because we might have this faulty assumption, going back to what you were saying before. If we assume that they're so rigid and non-adaptable, that is easily something that they could exploit against us. So
yeah, and I would say, and this is, if I could get people to retain one thing from this podcast and one opinion of mine, and we're almost 30 minutes in, so kind of unfortunate placement for the most important thing. But my catch-22 arguments with, don't get in an internet argument, because it won't help, because you can never win those. But my catch-22 argument, if you're having this debate, on ship, or you're sitting down with guys in the field or whatever else, is, what's the worst case scenario if I do think that the Chinese will be able to execute a ton of stuff at the tactical level with great initiative, and they will be able to execute at our level in every manner, and I just have to plan around systems and plan around fighting a very competent force that is going to make decisions at their level, that's going to adapt, that's going to improvise and stuff. Right? Like I plan to fight that force, and then when I fight that force, I win, because I'm the best in the world. I have the best troops in the world, and I plan for that. But if I plan to fight the force that's not going to think, that I think they're just going to be like, cut the head off the snake, and then they're just going to sit down and be effectively suppressed, or throw their weapons down like the Iraqis in 91, that's a force that you can lose against if you are, it doesn't matter if you're numerically superior, and it's the importance of studying history. You see in some of the records at the time, maybe some people have gotten some favorable views by historians and such, but you look at some of the things that, like, General MacArthur in the late 30s and 40s was thinking about Japan, or some of the things that the British in Singapore were thinking about the Japanese as well. And then, the British got absolutely embarrassed by a numerically much smaller force at Singapore. MacArthur obviously didn't do too hot against the Japanese when they came across the Philippines in 41 as well. And there are worse things that you can, MacArthur, even again in Korea, underestimated the Chinese specifically, and, definitely set back that war effort a little bit, and gave us the Battle of Chosin. But there's not really a downside to just assuming that they're going to be good. There's a lot of real world downside to, like, that egotistical is all I think it is, of like, oh, they can't do this. Like, I'm just going to rest on my laurels. And because I'm wearing Marpat, I'm going to carry the day regardless. And that's not the case.
As you were just saying that, one thing that came to mind for me is, I remember very early, maybe this was during TBS or IOC, but and I've taught this same class now dozens of times too. But I think when we have a tendency, put yourself in a scenario where you're on a squad patrol, one of your Marines gets killed, and there's rage, and you're starting to kind of be overwhelmed with emotional response, right? And you start to look at the enemy and maybe dehumanize them or think of them as lesser than. I just see a parallel in what you were just talking about between underestimating an enemy force, or I think you could go a step further if you take contact and you don't understand the emotions in your head, and kind of start to dehumanize and think of the enemy as a dog, and you're not adequately preparing or preparing yourself and your Marines to go up against it, then maybe you start overlooking and thinking, they're a dog, they can't make a decision. And that's where, again, you get caught on the back foot even more and more. So I think understanding that, I just saw a parallel there and wanted to bring it up. But
yeah, no, and that's a perfect tie-in to a real quick point I wanted to make, and this is to reinforce again that idea of the Chinese being this human wave force that's not going to be thinking, not going to be making tactical decisions, and that Xi Jinping or whoever else is going to be sitting in Beijing and saying, this is where I want this squad to maneuver. Like,
Right.
he's, or whatever theater commander is going to be saying, okay, tell them to increase to the rapid rate so that they can prep a rocket. Like, that's just not the case.
Right.
And a great Marine Corps example is, Evans Carlson, one of the original founders of the Raiders, founded what was at the time the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, or Carlson's Raiders. They did the Mackinac Island raid and everything else. And Carlson had extensive experience in China. And a lot of people know, that the gung ho comes from China, comes from Chinese communists specifically. But Carlson spent a lot of time literally embedded with Mao himself. Carlson has met Mao. He met Deng Xiaoping, who was also later the leader of communist China. And he spent, I want to say, close to 2 years with them, living with them, moving around by horseback through, rural China, and seeing how they interacted with the people. And Carlson, a bit of a polarizing figure for people that are really into politics. He was fairly left-leaning himself. And I know there's some contention about stuff after the war with Carlson, but a lot of the founding principles that the World War II Raiders had, and a lot of their mentalities, a lot of their organization, you can still find that in modern U.S. SOF. And that came from, in part, the communist Chinese. And the point I want to make with this is, when you say that China doesn't have recent combat experience, that is true. They did fight in the 20th century fairly extensively as leaders and advisors all across Asia. Obviously, they engaged pretty directly through a very thin guise of not being engaged in Korea. And then, as we know, they were very heavily engaged in World War II. Mm-hmm. And the point to make there is, think about how much combat the Marine Corps has faced since 1945. And think about how many things, even down to the squad level, decision-making, procurement decisions, putting bayonet lugs on things are still tied back to World War II experience. The Chinese, for them, because they've faced less combat since World War II, I would argue that World War II experience is much more recent. And when they were in World War II, they were largely a guerrilla force. They weren't the leading entity within China. That was the nationalist Chinese. So the communists were very much a guerrilla force. They were very into stereotypical guerrilla tactics. They were taught very heavily by American advisors with the OSS, and then guys pre-war, like I said, Carlson, and others that were interacting with the communists. And a lot of those foundational principles that the communists had when they fought for control of China have remained as sort of in the back burner of the PLA's culture. So things like trying to avoid casualties at all possible. If you go and look at some of the examples of the Korean War, you won't find really any period examples of sources from Marine officers, from U.S. Army officers that point to anything like a human wave attack. You have large attacks, but it's the Chinese trying to occupy every position by concealment, always at night, always in bad weather. They're trying to hold fire until the last possible moment and overwhelm you. They're trying to mitigate all of the firepower that we have by infiltration and all sorts of other things. And you can look at the PLA now and some of their procurement decisions and some of their tactical decisions and make some, again, analysis, assumption, whatever term you want to use. But you can sort of expect them to be a very solid, almost guerrilla style force in the same way that you would look at how a lot of US SOF would plan to fight, or how we even plan to fight in a lot of situations. Some things that people kind of discount with China, like, oh, they're going to be able to sustain larger casualties than us, is who knows, right? Like this, how many times have we had examples of world leaders thinking that the U.S. won't sustain casualties or anything else? But China seems to be very risk adverse with their exercises that they're doing, and part of that is the political angle of you want to have a good showing as a unit leader, and you want to be really restrictive of your guys. But a lot of their tactics are much more, I don't want to say organized hit and run, but they're much more guerrilla than ours are even. And that ties back to my example of much more aggressive maneuver or much more aggressive closure with the enemy. A lot of China's stuff, if you look at examples of the Sino-Vietnam War, you look at what they were telling their forces that they were training in Vietnam and things like that. And you can even go back now, and there's some great historical examples of Soviet officers and things that have written memoirs or historians have studied where the Soviets would send people to China and try to get them to develop this very Soviet style military that a lot of people assume the modern PLA is. This, monster of mass that's going to roll over anything with massed artillery and with massed everything in human waves. And all through the 20th century, the Soviets are generally trying to get the Chinese to develop that style military. And because their first big engagement post World War II, when they really became their own nation, was the US and Korea, they were, even going back to the 50s, you can find, they're not saying it directly, but there's some arguments between Soviet and Chinese officers where the Chinese are basically saying, look, if you try to do a Soviet-style military against the U.S., you're basically going to end up with what the 1991 Gulf War ended up being. Yeah. Of they're just going to smoke you with air power and precision fires for months before you ever even see someone on the ground. You turn back to Korea, where Mao's own son was sent with basically a meth level headquarters, and his entire headquarters, including himself, was destroyed by air power before they ever even got close to facing a U.S. force. And a lot of those things have been retained within the Chinese. And again, you look at their procurement decisions, and they're much more similar to ours with precision fires and survivable assets that can hit and then move around and maneuver behind the lines.
Yeah, something you said there, sorry. No, that was awesome. I'm just over here smiling. That was that was good. Something you said a minute ago that I wanted to circle back to quick was the assumption that we have about casualties in a potential conflict, because I can't remember who I was having this conversation with recently, but we look at the past 20 some years in Iraq and Afghanistan and the total casualties and killed in action. And I think the conversation was tying it to one of the many what if scenarios, but in a potential fight, if one of our ships were effectively targeted, you would reach and maybe even surpass, depending on the ship, the total number that we lost in Iraq and Afghanistan in one attack, essentially. And so I think that is a fascinating and both terrifying consideration, and maybe just going back to the faulty assumptions. But you've kind of alluded to a handful of pros and cons in the Marine Corps and maneuver warfare, and then pros and cons maybe of guerrilla warfare. One of the common things that I have been focusing on a lot, and I think this is just obvious for anyone right now, but we know that there's no movement that you can make on the battlefield that is going to be hidden, essentially, right? Like it's nearly impossible to be stealthy. And so how would a guerrilla warfare tactic, because we're getting close to closing here, so I think I'm just interested from your perspective, what do you see guerrilla warfare going up against maneuver warfare? If we know that really no side can remain hidden on the current battlefield, how would those tactics of guerrilla warfare and kind of sneaking in to positions and hit and run tactics, how do you think those would work against maneuver warfare?
Yeah, so just to clarify real quick, just pedantically, but the Chinese are absolutely not planning to conduct quote unquote guerrilla warfare.
Sure.
They do have their concept of systems warfare that is similar in many ways to maneuver warfare. Different. It's very fires focused, very critical vulnerability focused, essentially. Trying to find what they see as a critical system that's one little node, whether that's an individual commander, whether that's a specific system, whether it be GPS or whether it be something tactical, like at the squad level, hitting the radio or hitting the Carl Gustav or something.
Right.
They are very top to bottom, very critical vulnerability and target that focus. I just want to touch, I'm not sold on the transparent battlefield thing. We can chat offline actually, because I have some more stuff to talk about on that, but I'm not sold on the transparent battlefield thing specifically because of the one area that has very unique conditions that we're all kind of assuming are going to translate to everywhere else. The electronic environment that would occur in the Pacific from the US and from China would be something that the world has like never seen. And you're potentially looking at, the total actual kinetic destruction of the GPS system, the satellite clusters themselves, and things like that. So there's a lot to get into.
Right.
What ifs versus a very regional European war, where both sides of Suez that are creating this transparent battlefield are basically just entirely Chinese components. As much as both nations say they're doing domestic production, um, neither are producing chips or cameras or batteries, so they're kind of disassembling the important parts in China and then slapping them to shells and propellers and maybe electric motors that are assembled domestically. But with the transparent battlefield, I've heard it called that. I'm not sure what y'all are calling it over there at the schoolhouse, but yeah, it definitely, some of the principles of, if you're looking at like a guerrilla force with deception, and if you're going to be seen, and this is something that, God, almost 10 years ago when I first got into the Suez stuff. And it was a fairly common threat through ISIS, but it was definitely a harder sell to people at the time, trying to convince them that this is something that we needed to adjust our TTPs on. But things like decoys, things like, if you're going to be seen, then look like something that shouldn't be targeted, or look like something that should be targeted if you're trying to distract from something. It's definitely much more foxy, or like, Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. Foxy is probably not the right, that has a different connotation, I guess. But it ties back to some things or it reinforces some things that the Chinese already have codified in their doctrine. Things like embracing what they call special conditions, which are terrains and environmental factors that restrict movement or visibility. Things like hiding ambushes in swamps, like we would do in Vietnam, or things like, what's the old saying, and I don't want to get your podcast canceled, but like the French and Indians always attack at dawn and dusk, things like that. And they have principles like that. Or things like, oh, if it's a really heavy rainstorm, like a monsoon or something somewhere, instead of bedding down, like it's going to severely degrade if you're the Chinese, you say, oh, this monsoon is going to severely degrade my capabilities. But the Americans have much better thermals. They have much better night vision. They have much better optics. They have much better air power, and all of these things. That's going to degrade their capabilities much more significantly than it is mine. So I'm going to just put in doctrine, in their version of war fighting, essentially, hey, if it starts raining really badly or something like that, maybe you should initiate your operation, even if you're only partially planned. Essentially an 80% solution, if y'all are still using that term at the schoolhouse, for an attack, is like, hey, if you're planning on pushing this attack in the next 48 hours, and you're still waiting on some of your support, or you're still waiting on some of your firepower or something, but you're going to have a massive thunderstorm at night tonight, then go ahead and initiate, because that's going to degrade the Americans' capabilities much more than it degrades yours, because you're working from a lower basis, and they're probably not going to be expecting it. And if they are, they're going to have lower detection, lesser fire support available, and it's going to interfere with their comms and things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that has existed for a long time with the Chinese, and continues to be formally codified in their doctrine, that is just reinforced, or other people are having to adapt to, with this new transparent battlefield. I think it's a much more significant thing for us than it is for basically anyone else in the world that trains seriously. Because again, we've had that air superiority from the end of Korea to, depending on how you want to slice it, the early 2020s. Or we've had, comm superiority. We've had training superiority against everyone that we have faced or could have faced. I will continue to die on the hill that any fight with the Soviets would have just gone nuclear, because it would have looked like the 1991 Gulf War. But the Chinese have not been, they've been training to be the underdog this whole time. And now there's a lot of conditions that we're having to relearn. I don't want to say we're having to develop. We're just having to relearn things like, if you went and told a Marine from KSAW in Vietnam that we're having to relearn putting top cover on our fighting positions, he would just think that you were a shitty Marine. Pardon my French, because they'd be like, why aren't you putting top cover on your fighting positions?
Right.
Like, why did you stop doing that? That's always been in the book. You just got lazy. And some stuff like that. So same, turn it back to hand fighting, or turn it back to, whatever you want to do. If you went and told the dental battalion that they're going to have to start doing triage and exploratory surgeries, they would be like, why? And then you told a dentist from World War II that was on Iwo Jima that he'd have to do a triage of casualties at scale, and he'd be like, yeah, that's part of the job. What do you mean that's a groundbreaking thing? Right. So we're definitely having to relearn a lot of stuff that other people maybe aren't necessarily having to relearn.
I would argue that's maybe part of the reason that there's such a focus on brilliance in the basics, returning back to the simple things, yes. Because as we get more over-reliant on technology and new ways of fighting, like, hey, we can't forget the basics, because you even just talked about one of the what-if scenarios of GPS going down. Well, sucks to suck if you get your Garmin, your iPhone, or your Dagger on you. Good luck if you don't know how to use a mapping compass. As we get, we're going to transition to somewhat of an outro. This was an incredible conversation, and even looking at the time that we're at, I'm not even halfway done with the questions that I have for you. So I think we're going to have to do another one, super soon. But for this one, at least, as we put a bookmark in it, what closing message would you send to whether it's you 10 years ago or a Marine in your shoes right now down at the small unit level? What closing message would you send to them?
I would say biggest piece of advice for this podcast, and I think, I know it sounds like it sucks, but the more you study, the more you learn, it will reinforce this. The biggest thing that you need to do, speaking to your listeners directly, is you just have to know your own stuff. Because every time I look at a specific example of China, and we have to do a follow-on to just get deeper, because I feel like this was just a 40-minute ad for stuff that we actually need to talk about. Every time I study a specific thing and then think about, okay, what are we going to do about this? And then I go reference our actual doctrine and what we do, it's already in there. And even when it includes UAS, even when it includes, degraded comms environments, just truths that we've had for forever. Like radio comm should never be the primary. Obviously that's kind of a buzzword. Like you're not calling CAS with, colored smoke, but
right.
The more you know your own stuff, that's really all it takes. And I've worked in the Marine Corps. I had the opportunity, like I said, I've worked with the wing and seen the absolute professionalism of, guys that fly 5th generation fighters in the Marine Corps and in the Air Force. I've worked with the Navy Special Missions Unit doing CQB and training. And it's everything at whatever level that you think it's something super crazy is just actually the basics. And you're just at that point where you're just doing it right. And I would say, if you want to change the Marine Corps, if you want to change your unit, whether it's just you and your battle buddy, whether it's just you and your fire team, you and your squad, you and your platoon, if you want to change the Marine Corps overnight and make it unbelievably effective, you don't have to reinvent or learn anything. Just get your unit to the level where you and every other Marine can execute 100% of the time perfectly every TNR task that you have, and get everyone to a low first class PFT CFT, and get everyone to like a brown belt, and get everyone to expert. And that's literally, it could not be more revolutionary. I know it sounds silly, but anyone that has any sort of fleet time
will know how hard it is to achieve those.
I don't think we'll disagree with that. Yeah. So it goes back to, you can't think outside of the box unless you know the box.
Yep.
you can't reinvent anything if you're already failing at the task that you have. And if you're not 100% on all your TNR tasks as your unit or as yourself, then you're failing that test.
Yeah.
Because those aren't, you can do 80% of TNR tasks. If the 20% that you can't do are Neo related and you get sent to, somewhere in the Caribbean to do a Neo, that's a big problem.
100%.
Because we've told the combatant commander and the president that you can do that and you can't. So
yeah, jack of all trades, master of everything as well.
You just have to actually be a jack. Yeah, that's, people say jack of all trades, master of none. You better actually be a jack of all trades then. You better not be I just care about the stuff I care about, and it's just looking shitty in uniform and then having a grip pod on your rifle.
As cliche as it sounds, I mean, the quote of "you're not going to rise to the occasion, you'll fall back to the level of your training," I think it's actually quite accurate and pretty legit guidance to follow. Well, Ty, I think we're out of time for today. I will absolutely reach out to you again. I think maybe we can get another recording here sometime. We'll check our schedules, but hopefully pretty soon. I think it's about time that we go grab a beer, seeing as we're recording today on the Marine Corps' 250th birthday. So thank you again for taking like an hour out of your day to talk about some tactical tips and things for the small unit level. So appreciate it again on your time, and I'll take us out from here. All right, thank you again to Ty, otherwise known as Aura Ambush on Instagram. I will link his profile in the show notes. And if you took something useful from this episode today, please go ahead and share it with another leader in your platoon or send it to a Marine that you know. Just to recap again, we talked about today the importance of knowing your own stuff, having repetition of basic fundamental things. We can't be over-reliant on technology, because as soon as one of these million what-if scenarios plays out, you need to know every response before you get caught off guard. And so your ability to hammer home repetition of the individual basic fundamental level TNR tasks, as Ty said, I think is incredibly relevant for us to know. So that is something that you can control and take charge of. Thanks again for listening to this episode of Lost LT's Razor, and we will see you next week.
Folks, you've been listening to Lost LT's Razor with Lost LT and the Old Man. Join us again next week for another episode on wherever you get your podcasts. So until next time, Semper Fi.
All right.